The cost of police misconduct is a growing problem in Chicago. Taxpayers have already spent $189 million just this year to resolve misconduct lawsuits. That's compared to $107 million all of last year. Our next two guests argue different ways of approaching that problem, one by addressing the staggering clip of lawsuits, the other addressing police misconduct. Here with more on this are Paul Vallas, senior fellow at the Illinois Policy Institute and former candidate for Chicago mayor, and Antonio Romanucci, a civil rights attorney who represented George Floyd's family and other families impacted by police misconduct. Gentlemen, thanks to you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Paul Vallas, starting with you, please. What do you think are some of the factors that are driving these police misconduct settlements, both in volume and settlement amount?
Well, I think runaway juries is part of it. There's no limit. There's no caps. There's no, there's one, some of these firms, there was a recent settlement for two individuals, $120 million. There was another settlement, $50 million for 10 years for one individual. There's the bottom line is there's just simply no limit on the lawsuits altogether. Now, there are other states who do have limits, who do have structure governing those lawsuits, and even the federal government, permits there to be a cap on like private lawsuits and things like that. But the problem with cities and municipalities is government becomes a deep pocket, and I think that's what you're seeing here.
Well, and it's not all runaway juries. The city is settling some of these before they come to a jury.
Well, they're settling it because there's this perception here that if they don't settle it, because there's no limitations, they're going to have to pay more. And let me point out that there has been, I think the city's paid $1.1 billion since 2010 in lawsuits. About $700 million in lawsuits that were paid on police lawsuits in particular did not involve them proving the individuals were innocent, rather it was associated with police misconduct. I'm not making a value judgment, I'm just pointing it out. That's according to a study that the Sun-Times did. But there's, I think, 200 police cases, the 200 cases in the pipeline right now that could cost the city, if past patterns suggest, could cost the city anywhere from $1 billion to as much as $2 billion in taxpayer-funded settlements.
Tony Romanucci, you argue that legal action and financial costs, financial pain, that is how change gets made in many cases. Do you think the city of Chicago and the police department are responding by making change?
I don't think so. Part of the problem that we're dealing with is we're not fixing the problem. If we don't fix the policing problem first, then what we're going to continue to see are problems that develop over decades. What we're seeing right now, if you see a payment being made tomorrow or one being made a month ago, it's not a problem that started even a year or two ago. It's been decades long. The city of Chicago has not addressed these problems. Even under the current consent decree that they're cooperating with, we're not going fast enough, we're not doing enough. So if we don't fix the problem, we're going to continue to have these results. And what we're talking about, what Mr. Vallas was saying about the $120 million, those are wrongfully convicted people. And to me, it's quite insulting to think that wrongfully convicted individuals should have caps placed on what they receive. Just because they may have been poor or disenfranchised or marginalized when they went to prison doesn't mean that they are not entitled to full and fair justice.
I just have to respond to that. There are so many cases, and you can have a conversation with the city lawyers about the cases where individuals who have been released, obviously because of police misconduct, but between them and the state's attorney, they knew these individuals were guilty. They not only settled for massive settlements, but they were made millionaires. And if we had about 30 minutes, I could go through a litany of those type of cases. The point is, I believe that if there's police misconduct, people need to be compensated. I believe that if people go to jail, and unfairly, and the police have committed misconduct, they need to be held accountable. That's not what I'm talking about. But I'm talking about massive lawsuits, massive settlements. One law firm made $112 million in a single year and pocketed $42 million. So it's not like, even all that money is going into the hands of those individuals who are victimized. Also, let me point out that many of the individuals who are getting out and are being released and are settling for massive settlements are also individuals who have committed crimes in the community. And how about the victims? Because the overwhelming vast majority of these cases where arrests have been made, the individuals who were the victims of the violent crime were in fact Black and Latino, and poor Black and Latino. So what about those poor families?
So I do want to get to some of the, and I'm going to come back to you, I promise. But I do want to get to some of the reforms that you talk about, Paul Vallas. You suggest public education and judicial awareness, federal damages caps, reform the state's certificate of innocence statute, pursue civil claims against fraudulent lawsuits, and establish a special litigation division within the law department. And this is all included in the commentary, the op-ed that you wrote in the Chicago Tribune. I only want to talk about a couple of those because, like you said, we don't have 30 minutes. But you say some of these convictions are vacated based on a technicality versus actual evidence of innocence, and that somehow leads to these multi-million-dollar settlements. How so?
Well, I think they just try to maximize the benefits on any settlement. So there's been cases where clearly the police misconduct occurred. These individuals were innocent. They were unjustly, convicted, and certainly they're entitled to settlements. But there have been enough cases out there that the city has argued time and time again where the individuals in fact did commit the crime, but the police, through their investigations, committed malpractice. So the question is, should they be getting multi-million-dollar settlements in the process? So I'm just speaking to these cases that have been made, and you could look at the public record, and in some cases the judges have actually intervened to point that out. So at the end of the day, I'm simply talking about reasonable caps, because you have to understand, while the city has paid over the last 15 years $1.1 billion out in lawsuits, it's probably closer to $2 billion, because the city has to borrow in order to pay that, and the city has to take out insurance, and obviously you have the rising insurance costs, and the city is at the point now where they can't even get insurance for these big mega cases. So you're talking about a city that has $1.2 billion structural deficit, facing maybe another $1 billion in settlements.
In the case of there are some federal instances where there is a cap.
Where there is a cap, and some states have caps that provide, for example, if you're in prison, for each year you're in prison, you're allocated a certain amount. So there are different ways of imposing caps.
And you're granted that certificate of innocence in exchange for agreeing not to pursue
That's right.
civil suit.
And all I'm talking about is having a reasonable discussion on how we can contain the costs. So instead of, so that, because ultimately the property tax
containing the costs, right? Because taxpayers are paying for this. Tony Romanucci, you say that the police department, while they are cooperating with the consent decree, they're only at 16% after what, 10 years? I forget, a lot of years.
It's been since 2017.
Exactly. What do you propose? How should the police department be making change to avoid the kind of police misconduct settlements that gets the city into the courtroom?
So first of all, I just want to say that a lot of the proposals that Mr. Vallas puts on the table is a clear denial of due process. That's our 14th Amendment right. What he's saying, placing caps, amending the certificate of innocence, by definition, if you're wrongfully convicted and you are exonerated, you did not commit the crime, by definition. So what is it that we have to do in order to start? You have to start with training. It has to start with the bare bones basics. A lot of agencies across the United States do not train like they should, and they don't continue the training because it costs money. It's expensive. But guess what is more expensive? The problems that come from lack of training. So if you start with training, you will then resolve many of these litigation issues that are being discussed here today, because you're not going to have police misconduct. I would like nothing more than to be able to put myself out of business. If I cannot prosecute police misconduct cases, if I don't have to represent the mother or the father or a child who lost a loved one who was killed by police, I would be happy. I would be more than happy to have this discussion and continue this discussion at a round table and make sure that this doesn't happen.
Is there any other recourse for people who've been wrongfully convicted or maybe injured after a police chase, whatever it might be? Is there any other recourse beyond a civil suit?
Well, there are some recourses, but clearly, our system of democracy, the 7th Amendment, says that you are entitled to a civil jury trial. And let me tell you, it's the juries that do the hard work here. Because when there isn't an agreement, when there isn't a settlement, there is a trial. And then juries decide, juries of our peers. And they make the decisions. Not the lawyers, not the city lawyers, not the private lawyers, but a jury. and a judge oversees that jury to make sure that trial is conducted properly.
Well, that was 30 seconds.
Look, we could spend an hour going through these cases of individuals who were made millionaires in part, and not because they were proven innocent, but they got off because of police misconduct and technicalities. The bottom line is, if you go to your website, you talk about $1 billion in settlements. I mean, what percentage of that were kept by the law firm? This is a cottage industry, and they're making a tremendous amount of money. I'm simply talking about reasonable caps. Nothing I've suggested here is in any way unconstitutional. In fact, many of my proposals have been vetted by attorneys for the city, and these are recommendations that they have made. Let me make one comment. Oh, I think I'm out of time.
You're right. We are out of time. This
right.
has been a robust discussion, gentlemen, and I thank you both for joining us. I look forward to continuing this sometime in the future. Paul Vallas, Antonio Romanucci.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Up next, wrapping up a busy term at the U.S. Supreme Court, we look at the impact of some of those major decisions.